Wind cut through the trees in short, sharp bursts. Snow creaked under boots somewhere behind me. A horse snorted in the dark, impatient, stamping once against frozen ground. My breath came out loud, louder than I wanted, a thin cloud that felt like it gave me away. I could smell the forest before I could see it. Wet earth, rotting leaves, something musky and heavy that didn't belong to the cold. The hunters had already stopped talking. No signals, no instructions, just movement, slowing to almost nothing. Somewhere ahead of us, less than 100 meters away, was an animal that could weigh over 200 pounds. Thick hide, curved tusks, fast enough to close distance before you finish a second thought. A wild boar doesn't bluff. If it charges, someone bleeds. There was no rifle, no scope, no truck waiting nearby. What they carried instead looked simple, even primitive, until you remembered people here have been feeding families this way for centuries. I realized then how quiet everyone had become. How final the next minutes could be. How do you hunt a 200-pound wild boar on foot using traditional Mongol methods and expect to walk back out? I followed them forward to find out. Daylight came slowly, as if the land was deciding whether to reveal itself at all. The forest thinned without warning, trees giving way to open ground that stretched farther than my sense of distance could manage. This was the edge. Behind us, dark trunks and tangled brush. Ahead, rolling steppe broken by low hills and patches of scrub that offered cover to anything smart enough to use it. The air was sharp and dry. Each breath felt like it scraped the inside of my chest. Wind moved across the grass in uneven waves, bending it flat one moment, lifting it the next. Sound didn't travel here the way I expected. It disappeared, swallowed by space. I shifted my weight to keep warm. My fingers were already stiff inside my gloves. The hunters didn't seem to notice the cold at all. They moved easily, adjusting straps, checking the wind with a glance instead of a gesture. No wasted motion, no talking. Their clothing was worn, practical, repaired many times over. Nothing decorative, nothing extra. They stood with the land instead of against it, reading it the way I might read a map. Out here, there was nowhere to hide mistakes. The landscape didn't care who you were or why you came. It only reacted. We still hadn't seen the boar, but the land had. That part was obvious. The ground ahead of us was torn up in wide, shallow arcs, soil flipped over and frozen hard again. Roots lay exposed like snapped wires. Low bushes were broken at the base, not bitten or torn, but shoved aside with weight and momentum. The smell came next, thick, sour. Animal and earth mixed together. It hung low, catching in the back of my throat when the wind shifted wrong. One of the hunters paused and pointed with his chin. No words, just direction. Boars don't announce themselves. They move when you aren't looking, stay still when you are. You don't spot them first. You stumble into the space they already control. The hunters later told me most injuries happen before anyone ever sees the animal. Too close, too fast, no time to react. Somewhere ahead, brush moved once, then stopped. Could have been wind, could have been nothing. That was the problem. With a boar, absence doesn't mean safety, it means you're late. The hunters crouched near the churned ground and studied it the way mechanics study an engine. One pressed his thumb into the soil, then rubbed it between his fingers. Another traced a half-moon groove left by a tusk and shook his head slightly. They spoke quietly, short phrases, more confirmation than discussion. I thought I saw a clear track heading downhill and pointed it out. One of them glanced where I was indicating, then calmly moved my hand a few inches to the left. Older, he said. The edges were crumbling. Frost had settled into the impression. Not fresh. Fresh signs had weight to them. The earth was still damp beneath the crust. Grass bent, but not broken, had sprung partway back. Rooting that looked violent to me was actually hours old. The newer damage was subtle. A shallow cut here, a scuffed stone there. Direction revealed itself only when you stopped trying to force a pattern. They paid constant attention to the wind. A shift of a few degrees changed everything. One hunter lifted a pinch of dry grass and let it fall. Wrong direction. We waited. After a while, I began noticing things before they pointed them out. Not confidently, not correctly every time, but enough to understand this wasn't instinct. It was memory, built slowly, mistake by mistake, with consequences attached. Time flattened out. Minutes stopped meaning much once we settled into position. The hunters spaced themselves without speaking, each choosing cover that broke their outline without blocking movement. I copied them, badly, shifting until a glance told me to stop. Silence took over completely. Not the absence of sound, but the kind where every noise matters. Wind sliding through grass. A branch ticking once as it cooled. My own breathing, which I worked to slow until it matched the pace around me. We waited, then waited longer. Nothing moved. That didn't mean the boar wasn't there. It meant it was better at waiting than I was. I kept wanting to adjust my footing. My leg tingled where it pressed against frozen ground. Each small discomfort felt urgent, demanding attention. The hunters ignored theirs. They watched the brush without staring at it, listening more than looking. One tilt of the head, one raised finger. Then stillness again. Wind shifted slightly. We froze completely. A boar that catches human scent doesn't run blindly. It circles. It charges. People get hurt when they rush this part, when they try to make something happen instead of letting it happen. Patience here wasn't calm, it was survival. This was the point where tools stopped being abstract. Until now, they had been weight on a shoulder or leather wrapped tight against cold. Here, they mattered. One hunter eased a long spear free from where it had been riding along his back. The shaft was smooth from use, darkened where hands had gripped it over years. The blade wasn't large, but it was thick and narrow, built to punch through dense muscle and cartilage instead of slicing. A wild boar's shoulder can stop a poorly placed strike cold. Another carried a short, heavy knife, blade wide near the tip. This wasn't for throwing or display. It was for close work, when distance disappears and decisions compress into seconds. I noticed how every tool had a single purpose. Nothing decorative, nothing adaptable. There were dogs too, waiting farther back. Quiet, controlled, trained not to rush in blindly. Dogs that break formation around a boar get gored. Hunters who trust the wrong moment follow them. One of the men caught me looking and said simply, "You don't learn this fast." No pride, no warning tone, just fact. They practice for years before being allowed forward. Learn where to stand, when not to move, how to read an animal that doesn't retreat when wounded. A boar fights harder when it's hurt. Out here, mistakes don't turn into lessons. They turn into scars. Or worse, this hunt didn't offer retries. You got it right, or you paid for it immediately. The brush exploded without warning. 1 second it was still. The next, it wasn't. A dark mass pushed through low branches with a sound like wood snapping underfoot. The boar came out low and fast, all muscle and momentum, head swinging as it tried to decide which direction meant escape. No one shouted. There was no signal I could hear. The hunters moved at the same time, not toward the animal, but into position. Distance collapsed instantly. What had felt far away was suddenly too close. The spear flashed once, not a swing, a drive, straight forward. The impact landed with a dull, solid sound like striking wet earth. The boar slammed sideways, legs digging in, weight throwing itself against the shaft. Everything happened in seconds. Breath, footing, pressure. Then the animal surged again, trying to wrench free. Blood darkened the bristles along its shoulder. The strike had landed true, I could see that much. But the boar was still on its feet, still powerful, still dangerous. The hunt wasn't over. It had only just begun. The boar didn't collapse. It twisted hard, muscles bunching under its hide as it tried to turn back toward the pressure. A wounded boar doesn't flee the way other animals do. It looks for what hurt it. The hunter with the spear leaned his weight forward, not pulling back, using the shaft to keep the animal's head angled away from us. Another moved in immediately, wide to the side, timing his steps to the boar's surges. No shouting, no panic, just short commands, spoken low. The dogs were released then, not to attack, but to distract. They circled just out of reach, snapping once, darting back. The boar lunged toward them, buying the hunters seconds they needed. Seconds mattered here. A second line was brought in fast, looped around the hind leg and pulled tight. The boar screamed, a harsh, tearing sound that cut through everything. It thrashed violently, hooves digging furrows into the frozen ground. I stayed where I was told, close enough to see every movement, far enough to stay alive. This part was about control, not force. One mistake, one slip, a tusk connects. Everyone knew it. They worked as one body, tightening space until the animal's movement slowed. Only then did the urgency ease, slightly. Once the boar was finally down, the weight of it became real. not as an idea, but as something that refused to move. 200 pounds of muscle and bone doesn't lift. It resists. It sinks into the ground and stays there. Blood soaked into the soil beneath its chest, turning dirt to slick mud. Every time we tried to shift it, the body seemed to settle deeper, like it was anchoring itself out of spite. One of the hunters nodded for me to grab a leg and pull. I did. For about 3 seconds. The leg barely moved. My boots slid instead. My back lit up immediately, muscles complaining in a language I understood too well. The hunters didn't laugh. They just waited until I let go and stepped back without saying anything. They repositioned instead of pulling harder. One man lifted the head slightly, another rolled the shoulder just enough to break suction with the ground. They used gravity, angles, their own weight leaning backward in short, controlled steps. The boar shifted inch by inch. It wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. It was tiring in a way that crept in quietly. When the animal finally moved clear of the mud, sweat had frozen on collars and brows. This part humbled me more than the charge ever could. Strength mattered, but knowing how to use it mattered more. No one suggested carrying it the whole way back. That wasn't how this worked. A short distance from where the boar fell, 2 horses waited, heads low, reins looped loosely over a tree branch. They'd been positioned earlier, long before contact, because planning comes before effort. The hunters lashed the boar to a simple wooden frame, poles worn smooth where loads had rested for years. Rope passed under the chest and around the hindquarters, tied with knots that held under strain, but could be released fast if something went wrong. Horses spook, loads shift, you prepare for both. The animals were brought in slowly, allowed to see and smell the carcass before being asked to move. No rushing, no shouting. A calm horse pulls better than a frightened one. Once the frame was lifted and balanced, the horses leaned into their traces and stepped forward together. This method hadn't changed much in generations because it didn't need to. Wheels fail in mud and snow, engines break, horses adjust. They read ground and pace themselves. We walked alongside, guiding, steadying when needed. The boar moved with us now, no longer dangerous, just heavy. Another task completed, one more still ahead. They didn't wait to reach camp. As soon as the load was settled and the horses tied off, knives came out. Not many, each one chosen for a reason. Short blades, thick spines, edges kept sharp enough to work without force. The first cut was deliberate and shallow, just enough to open the hide without damaging what lay beneath. Hands followed the blade, separating skin from fat with steady pressure. No sawing, no rushing. The hide peeled back in long sections, heavy and warm despite the cold air. I stood where I was told and watched. When I shifted too close, one of the hunters nudged me back with his boot and said, "Better you don't learn this part by mistake." It was delivered flat, without humor. Then a moment later, another added, "You can carry later," and the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Everything had a place. Organs were removed intact and set aside. Cuts were sorted without discussion. Blood was kept off the meat as much as possible. The ground beneath was used, but not abused. What struck me was the care. This wasn't hurried work done out of hunger. It was practiced handling, shaped by knowing exactly how much effort this animal had required. Wasting any part would have felt wrong. I stayed quiet and out of the way, which seemed to be the most useful thing I could do. Back at camp, the work shifted from cutting to planning. What would be eaten soon was separated first. The rest was handled with time in mind. Not hours or days, but weeks and months. Thin strips of meat were hung where smoke from the fire would reach them without cooking them. The smoke was cool and constant, enough to dry the surface and keep insects away. Other cuts were laid out in the open cold, where air moved freely and temperatures stayed low. Winter here does the work a refrigerator does elsewhere, without electricity or walls. Fat was treated carefully, rendered slowly, stored separately, used later for cooking and preserving. Nothing about it was rushed. This wasn't about saving food in an emergency. It was about feeding people when hunting wasn't possible. One of the hunters noticed me watching and said, "Cold is storage." That was the explanation. No lecture, no comparison drawn out loud, but it was hard not to think about how much planning this required. You don't decide these things after the hunt. You decide them before the season starts. Modern freezers make forgetting easy. Here, forgetting meant hunger. Every cut placed where it belonged was a decision made for the future. The work continued until everything had a purpose. Once the meat was sorted and secured, portions began to disappear without ceremony. No list was made. No one called names. People arrived, spoke quietly with the hunters, and left carrying what they needed. The first bundles went to the elders. Choice cuts, fat, wrapped carefully. Nobody debated it. Nobody needed to explain why. It was simply the order things moved in. After that came households without hunters. A woman with 2 young children received meat without asking. A man whose knee no longer allowed him to hunt nodded once in thanks and walked away. I asked how they decided who got what. One of the hunters looked at me for a moment, then said, "We know." That was the whole answer. There was no sense of generosity attached to it, no pride, no expectation of gratitude. This wasn't giving, it was distribution. A system built around the understanding that success rotates. Today's hunter might be injured next season. Weather changes, animals move. No one stays lucky forever. When I asked if they ever kept more for themselves, the answer came quickly. If we did, one said, someone would remember. The idea wasn't moral, it was practical. You share because someday you won't have anything to share. And when that happens, you'll still eat. What impressed me wasn't that the sharing worked, it was that no one seemed to manage it. There were no scales, no tallies, no one overseeing the process. Meat moved from hand to hand as if guided by something everyone could see but me. People knew when to step forward and when to stay back. They knew which cuts were theirs to take and which weren't. No one tested the boundaries. No one tried to take more than their share. That kind of behavior would have stood out immediately, not because of punishment, but because it didn't fit. This system didn't rely on trust in the abstract. It relied on memory, on knowing who had shared before, who had needed help, who would need it again. These were things carried in people's heads, passed on without instruction. I realized that nothing about this was informal. It was simply undocumented. Rules existed, but they lived in practice instead of writing. They were reinforced every season, every hunt, every meal. Stability here didn't come from enforcement, it came from repetition, from doing the same things the same way long enough that no one questioned them anymore. Trust wasn't declared, it was inherited. That evening, the house was warm in a way the land outside never would be. Steam rose from a pot set low over the stove. The smell was rich and familiar to everyone there except me. Fat, sizzling lightly. Meat simmered long enough to soften without losing itself. We sat close together. Bowls passed hand to hand. No one waited for a signal to start. Children ate first. Elders ate slowly. Conversation drifted between subjects without settling anywhere for long. The hunt wasn't discussed. It didn't need to be. When I took my first bite, I expected something dramatic. Instead, it tasted solid. Honest. Food that had earned its place on the table. I thought about the charge in the brush, the wait in the mud, the hours of waiting where nothing happened. All of it was there, quietly, in that mouthful. No one spoke about danger. No one talked about bravery. The work had already been done. What mattered now was that everyone was eating, that tomorrow and next week were accounted for. I realized then that the hunt wasn't the center of this story. Dinner was. The hunt was just the longest, hardest step required to make this moment ordinary. When the bowls were empty, they were refilled if anyone wanted more. When they were finished, they were cleaned and stacked away. Outside, the wind moved across the steppe the same way it had that morning, indifferent to all of it. I left the table understanding something I hadn't before. Not everything that carries risk is meant to feel dramatic. Some things are dangerous simply because they're necessary.